Richard Holloway slid the cardboard box across the table and said in front of 40 people, "You're done. Pack your things and get out." Daniel Carter looked at the box. He looked at the room full of people who wouldn't meet his eyes. He picked up the box. He didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't say a single word. He walked straight to the parking lot, put the box in his truck, and reached under the seat for a phone nobody knew existed. One contact, one number, 5 years untouched. He dialed. The man picked up before the second ring. Daniel said 3 words, "Fire them all." 30 minutes later, black SUVs rolled through Northstar's front gate, and the last man to step out was wearing 4 stars on his shoulder. Richard Holloway had just made the worst mistake of his career. And he did it in front of 40 witnesses. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if you believe men like Daniel still exist, hit subscribe. This one's for them. The morning they fired him, Daniel Carter woke up at 4:47 a.m. Not because of an alarm. He hadn't used an alarm clock in 11 years, not since his first deployment, when the Navy taught him that the body, if trained right, doesn't need one. It just knows. It wakes before danger arrives. He lay in the dark for a moment, staring at the ceiling. In the next room, he could hear his daughter breathing. Soft, steady, completely unbothered by the world. Lily was 8 years old, and she slept the way only people with a clear conscience can sleep, deep and full, like the night owed her something. He got up quietly. He moved through the kitchen without turning on a light. He knew every inch of that apartment, where the floorboard creaked by the refrigerator, where the cabinet door stuck. If you pulled it wrong, where Lily had taped a drawing of the 2 of them onto the wall at eye level, so it would be the first thing he saw every morning. He stood in front of that drawing for a second. She'd drawn him with a big smile and huge hands. In the drawing, his hands were almost as large as his entire body. He didn't smile at it the way he usually did. Something already felt wrong. He made coffee. He packed Lily's lunch: peanut butter and honey, no crusts, and apple sliced into 8 pieces the way she liked it. He wrote a small note and folded it inside the bag. "Have a great day, kid. I'll be home by 6. Love, Dad." He'd written some version of that note almost every school day for 3 years. Since her mother left. Since it became just the 2 of them against a world that didn't slow down for anyone. He showered. He put on his work shirt, plain blue, Northstar Maritime Technologies logo on the chest. He looked at himself in the mirror for a moment longer than usual. He looked tired, not the tired that goes away with sleep. The kind that settles into your bones after months of fighting something quietly alone, without anyone telling you that you're not crazy for fighting it. He drove Lily to school. She talked the whole way about a book she was reading, about a girl in her class who had a dog named Biscuit, about how she wanted to learn to cook eggs by herself. "I can teach you this weekend," Daniel said. "Promise, promise." She kissed him on the cheek and ran through the school doors without looking back. That was her style. She didn't linger. She got that from him. Northstar Maritime Technologies occupied a campus-style facility outside Alexandria, Virginia, close enough to Washington that government contractors could pretend they were part of something important, far enough that the actual work could happen without too many eyes on it. They built electronic systems for U.S. Navy vessels. Power distribution units, integrated circuit boards, the kind of hardware that went into combat ships and submarine support systems. The kind of hardware that, if it failed at the wrong moment in the wrong place, didn't just break down. It killed people. Daniel had understood that from day one. Most people at Northstar understood it too, in the abstract way you understand something you've read on a safety poster. In the way you nod when someone reminds you that quality matters, and then you go back to worrying about your quarterly numbers. Daniel understood it differently. He understood it because he had been on the other end. He had been on ships when equipment failed. He had felt the difference between a system that was built right and one that was built fast. He had watched men scramble in the dark when something that was supposed to work didn't, and he had learned in those moments that the distance between a technical deficiency report and a body bag was sometimes measured in weeks. When he first walked into the maintenance bay at Northstar 6 months ago, he brought that understanding with him. Nobody asked him to. Nobody wanted him to. His job title was Maintenance Operations Supervisor Level 2, which meant he oversaw a team of 12 technicians responsible for the upkeep of production equipment. He was not a design engineer. He was not a quality assurance director. He was not in the chain of command for anything that happened before a product left the floor. His supervisor, a man named Greg Paulson, made that clear on Daniel's first day. "You keep the machines running," Greg told him, leaning against a filing cabinet like he was delivering wisdom. "That's it. You don't audit. You don't inspect finished products. You don't write reports about things outside your lane." "What if I notice something?" Daniel asked. Greg looked at him the way people look at someone who just asked a question with an obvious answer. "You tell me, and I decide whether it matters." Daniel said nothing, but he noticed everything. 3 weeks into the job, he found the first anomaly. A batch of power conditioning units, PCUs, the components, responsible for regulating electrical output to a ship's navigation and weapon systems, had passed final inspection and were staged for shipping. Daniel had no reason to be looking at them. He was in that section of the floor because one of his machines needed a part from the storage area nearby. But he saw it. A unit had a small scratch near the seal housing. The kind of scratch that happens when someone has opened a sealed unit and closed it back up in a hurry. He stopped. He looked at the inspection stamp on the unit. Passed. Signed off. Dated 2 days ago. He looked at the scratch again. He picked up the unit, it wasn't heavy, and turned it over slowly in his hands. There was a second mark. Faint, almost invisible. The kind you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. He set it down carefully. He wrote down the serial number in the small notebook he carried in his back pocket. An old habit from the Navy. Write everything down. Memory is unreliable. Paper isn't. He went and found his work. He said nothing that day. But that night, after Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop and pulled up every piece of documentation he had access to on those units. He found a quality hold notice issued 6 weeks earlier, flagging PCUs from that production run for potential wiring irregularities. The notice had been closed out. Resolve, the file said. No corrective action documentation. No retest results. No sign-off from the engineering team. Just resolved. Daniel stared at that word for a long time. He went to Greg the next morning. "I need to flag something," he said. Greg was at his desk eating a breakfast burrito and reading something on his computer. He didn't look up. "Flag it in the system," Greg said. "I tried. I don't have access to quality records." "Then it's not in your lane." Greg. Daniel put the notebook on the desk. "I've got the serial number of a PCU that was opened after its final seal. It was on the shipping floor with a pass stamp. There's a QA hold on that production run that was closed without documentation. I think, Carter." Greg looked up now finally. "What's your job title?" Daniel said nothing. "Maintenance Operations Supervisor," Greg said. "Level 2. You know what that means? It means you supervise maintenance. It doesn't mean you audit QA. It doesn't mean you review shipping manifests. It doesn't mean you come to my desk and tell me what you think about product integrity." He picked up his burrito again. "We have an entire quality assurance department. They handle that. Do your job." Daniel picked up his notebook. He walked out. He didn't argue, but he also didn't stop. Over the next 4 months, the notebook filled up. He found 3 more PCUs with signs of post-seal tampering, all on the same production run, all bearing pass stamps from the same QA inspector, a man named Roy Hendricks, who Daniel started watching carefully. He discovered that a safety flag submitted by a technician named Marcus Webb had disappeared from the internal system. Webb himself came to Daniel one afternoon quiet and clearly unsettled. "I put in a report," Webb said, 2 weeks ago, about the thermal tolerance readings on the M-series boards. "And," Daniel said, "and it's gone. I checked this morning. The report number doesn't pull up anything. It's like I never filed it." "Did you save a copy?" Webb shook his head. "Save copies," Daniel said quietly. "Of everything. Don't send anything by company email. Write it down by hand if you have to." Webb stared at him. "You think someone's deleting them?" Daniel didn't answer that directly. I think paperwork sometimes gets lost. Make sure yours doesn't. Webb nodded slowly, like a man who had just realized the building he was standing in might not have the foundation he thought it did. Daniel also found Evan Miller. Evan was 26, a junior electrical engineer who had been transferred from quality control to a clerical support role in procurement about 4 months before Daniel arrived. It was the kind of transfer that looks like a lateral move on paper and feels like a punishment in practice. Evan was quiet around most people. But Daniel had a way of making people feel like their words would be handled with care. It was something he'd learned working with enlisted men, the ones who'd seen things they didn't talk about in groups. One afternoon, Daniel sat down next to Evan in the break room and didn't say anything for a moment, just sat. Evan spoke first. "You've been looking at the M-Series line," Evan said. It wasn't a question. "What do you know about it?" Daniel asked. Evan looked around the room. 2 other employees at a table near the window not paying attention. "I wrote a report in January," Evan said, "about the power variance thresholds on the M7 unit. They were running outside tolerance on about 8% of the production run. Not catastrophically, but enough that under sustained load conditions, especially in a combat environment, you could see failure." "What happened to the report?" "My director told me the tolerances had been re-evaluated and the units were within acceptable parameters." "Were they?" Evan looked at the table. "The parameters were changed, retroactively, in the system, to match the actual readings." Daniel let that sit for a moment. "They moved the line," Daniel said. "Instead of fixing the problem," Evan confirmed. "And you?" 3 weeks later, I was reassigned. Evan finally looked up. "They didn't fire me. They just made sure I couldn't see what I'd been seeing." "But you remember what you saw?" "Every number." Evan tapped his temple. "I remember every number." Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a second notebook he'd started carrying too by this point. He slid it across the table to Evan. "Write them down," he said. By the end of month 4, Daniel had accumulated a record that no single person at Northstar knew existed. 3 tampered PCUs with serial numbers and photographic documentation taken on a personal phone never connected to the company network. 2 deleted safety reports with dates, employee names, and the system reference numbers that led nowhere. The retroactive parameter adjustment on the M7 units with the original threshold data Evan had kept in his personal notes. A pattern of pressure for employees. Webb Miller, a woman named Sandra Cho from the testing lab, and a senior technician named Paul Reyes had all raised technical concerns in the past year, and all had experienced sudden role changes, performance reviews, or disciplinary write-ups within 2 months of doing so. Daniel wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't an investigator. He didn't know exactly what all of this amounted to in legal terms. But he knew what it felt like. It felt like the documentation he'd seen buried once before. 5 years ago. On a ship. After a mission went wrong. He kept that connection at the edge of his mind and didn't look at it too directly. Not yet. He needed to stay focused on what was in front of him. What was in front of him was enough. He made one attempt to go above Greg. He requested a meeting with the director of operations, a man named Frank Aldridge, through proper channels. It took 2 weeks to get 15 minutes with him. Aldridge's office had a view of the parking lot and a shelf of framed certificates from industry associations. He was the kind of man who looked comfortable in every room because he had never spent time in a room where things actually went wrong. Daniel laid out his findings methodically. He didn't editorialize. He didn't use words like fraud or cover-up. He stuck to specifics. Dates, serial numbers, employee names, documented discrepancies. Aldridge listened with his hands folded on his desk, face neutral. When Daniel finished, there was a silence. Then Aldridge said, "Daniel, I appreciate you bringing your concerns forward. That takes initiative." Daniel waited. "But I have to be honest with you. What you're describing, these are complex technical matters that fall under the jurisdiction of our quality assurance and compliance teams. They have processes. They have expertise. When you see something that concerns you, the right approach is to file it through the appropriate channels." "I've tried the appropriate channels," Daniel said. Reports are being removed from the system. That's a serious accusation. I have documentation. I'm sure you believe what you've documented, Aldridge said. His voice was perfectly even, perfectly professional. The voice of a man who had said variations of this sentence many times and never lost a night of sleep over it. But I'd encourage you to consider that there may be context you're not fully aware of. Technical specifications get updated. Parameters get reevaluated. It happens constantly in a development environment. The parameters were changed to match out-of-tolerance readings, Daniel said, not the other way around. Aldridge smiled slightly. I'll make sure this is reviewed by the appropriate team. Daniel left the office knowing nothing would be reviewed by anyone. He was right. 2 weeks after the meeting with Aldridge, Greg called Daniel in and placed a written warning in his personnel file. Failure to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. Disruption of interdepartmental workflows. Daniel read it. He signed it without comment. He took his copy and placed it in the folder he kept at home in the locked drawer of the desk in his bedroom. Lily knocked on the door while he was doing it. Dad, can I show you something? He closed the drawer, turned around, and made his face do the thing it had learned to do, clear, open, present. Yeah, kid, come in. She came in with a drawing she'd made at school. She was going through a phase of drawing houses, elaborate imaginary houses with towers and gardens, and sometimes inexplicable staircases on the outside walls. This one has a secret room, she explained, pointing to a small rectangle she'd drawn in the corner of the house. It's where the important things go. He looked at the drawing. He looked at his daughter. Smart design, he said. She beamed. After she left, he sat on the edge of his bed for a moment. He thought about what he was doing. He thought about the risks. He thought about what could go wrong and what Lily's life looked like if it did. And then he thought about those PCUs. Staged for shipping. Destined for Navy vessels. Destined for ships where the men operating them would have no idea that someone had moved the safety line instead of fixing what was behind it. He thought about that, and the choice became simple again. Not easy. Never easy. But simple. 6 weeks before the end, a new problem emerged. A production supervisor named Kevin Briggs approached Daniel with a look that Daniel recognized immediately, the look of a man who had been told to do something he didn't want to do. Got something for you, Briggs said, and handed him a work order. Direct from Holloway's office. You're being reassigned temporarily to oversee the shipping preparation area. Daniel read the order. The shipping preparation area meant he would be working directly with the batches of equipment that were being readied for delivery. It also meant someone wanted him in a position where if anything was discovered later, his signature would be on documentation near the problem. He understood the move immediately. When does this start? Daniel asked. Monday. Okay. Briggs hesitated. You understand what this is, right? I understand everything, Daniel said. Briggs looked at him for a moment longer, then walked away. That night, Daniel called a number he hadn't used in nearly 2 years. A woman named Carol Sims, who worked at the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General. He'd met her once at a veterans event, and she'd given him a card and said the way people do who mean it, call me if you ever see something that needs seeing. The call lasted 11 minutes. He told her what he had. She was quiet for a moment at the end. Then she said, "Are you prepared for what comes next if you take this further?" What comes next? You file a formal complaint through us. They will know it came from inside. They'll come for your credibility, your performance record, whatever they can find. I know, Daniel said. You have a daughter, she said. Not accusingly, just as a fact she had noted and wanted him to acknowledge. I do, he said. Then make sure you're certain. I'm certain, he said. But I'm not ready to file yet. I need a little more time. She said she understood. She told him to call back when he was ready. He hung up and sat in the kitchen for a while, the house quiet around him, and thought about the line between courage and recklessness, and whether there was ever a moment when a man could be completely sure he was standing on the right side of it. He decided the uncertainty was part of it. The men he'd respected most in the Navy, in every room he'd ever been in, were the ones who acted right even when they weren't sure everything would turn out right. That had to be enough. The morning of the firing, a Friday in late March, Daniel arrived at 6:45. He had his notebook. He had his personal phone. He had the knowledge of where every piece of documentation was, including 2 USB drives he'd left in places that had nothing to do with his apartment or his car. He did not know what was coming. Not specifically, but he had learned to pay attention to the atmosphere of a place. And something in Northstar that morning felt different. Too many people in places they didn't normally stand. A cluster of managers outside Aldridge's office before 7 a.m. Greg passing him in the hallway without making eye contact. Daniel went to his workstation. He pulled up his shift schedule. He started his morning checks. At 8:20, his phone buzzed. A text from Greg. Report to the main conference room. Now. Not the kind of message that meant a routine meeting. Daniel took his notebook. He left everything else. The main conference room at Northstar was on the second floor, all glass on one side, visible from the main production floor below. 30, maybe 40 people were already in the room or crowded near the glass outside it when Daniel arrived. He didn't know why they were there. He found out quickly. Richard Holloway was at the head of the table. Holloway was 58, gray at the temples, the kind of man who had the bearing of someone important, even in a casual setting. He'd built Northstar from a mid-size government contractor into something considerably larger over 15 years. He knew how to move in rooms full of powerful people. He knew how to handle problems. Right now, he was looking at Daniel with the composed, slightly disappointed expression of a man who had made a decision he was comfortable with. Arrayed beside him were Aldridge, the head of HR, and 2 people Daniel didn't recognize. Legal, he assumed. "Daniel," Holloway said. "Come in. Close the door." Daniel did. He looked around the room. 14 people seated. 5 or 6 more standing. "Sit down," Holloway said. "I'm fine standing," Daniel said. A small pause. Holloway continued, "I'll be direct. Over the past several months, there have been a series of incidents involving interference from your team with the QA and production departments. Unauthorized inquiries. Conversations with employees in other divisions that fall outside your operational scope. The distribution of..." He glanced at a paper in front of him. "Unsolicited documentation to personnel without authorization." Daniel said nothing. "You were warned," Holloway continued. "You received a formal written warning 6 weeks ago. Despite that, the behavior continued. And I've been informed that you've been asking questions, pointed specific questions about product specifications and internal documentation that frankly don't belong in your purview." Daniel looked at him steadily. "What you've been doing," Holloway said, and his voice dropped just slightly, just enough to signal that he was moving from the official statement to something more personal, "has put this company in a very difficult position. We are currently in active contract negotiations with the Department of the Navy. Our timeline is critical. Our reputation is critical. And when an employee, regardless of their intentions, introduces uncertainty into that environment, it creates harm. The harm," Daniel said quietly, "is already in the equipment." The room went very still. Holloway's expression didn't change. If anything, it became calmer. "I'm going to stop you there," he said. "Because what you're about to say is something I'd strongly advise you not to put on record in a room full of witnesses without legal counsel present." Daniel looked at him. Then he looked around the room. He looked at Greg, who was staring at the table. At Aldridge, who was examining something on the far wall. At the HR director, who had developed a sudden fascination with the cap of her pen. He looked at the junior employees standing near the glass. Some of them people he'd talked to, people who had brought him concerns, people who were now watching him from a distance, with expressions that mixed something that looked like guilt, with something that looked like fear. "Daniel," Holloway said, "you are no longer a good fit for this organization." He slid a cardboard box across the table. Small. Just large enough for a coffee mug, a photo, a couple personal items. "Your personal belongings from your workstation are in there. Security will escort you out. Your final paycheck will be processed according to Virginia employment law. If you have questions, HR will provide you with documentation." Holloway stood. "I'm sorry it came to this." He said it with the kind of professionalism that was almost more insulting than anger would have been. Daniel picked up the box. He looked at the room one more time. Not at Holloway. Not at Aldridge or Greg. He looked at the junior employees by the glass. He looked at them long enough that some of them had to look away. He wanted them to remember that look. He turned and walked out. The security escort was a man named Pete, who Daniel had always liked, a retired Army corporal. Quiet professional. Pete walked alongside him without speaking, which Daniel appreciated. They went down the stairwell across the main floor, and here the production line was running, and men and women were working, and some looked up and some didn't. And the ones who looked up wore expressions that Daniel understood deeply. The helpless recognition of someone who sees a wrong being done and has already decided they are not the one to stop it. Daniel didn't blame them. He had been that person once a long time ago. He'd promised himself he wouldn't be again. Pete held the door open at the main exit. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," he said. "You too, Pete." He walked across the parking lot. He put the box in the passenger seat of his truck. He got in. He sat for a moment. The engine wasn't running. The parking lot was mostly quiet, just the distant sound of machinery from inside the building. He reached under the seat. The phone was there exactly where he'd put it, in a small magnetic case attached to the underside of the seat. He'd put it there the week he started at Northstar, not because he knew this day would come, but because he'd learned that you put emergency equipment somewhere accessible before you need it. He held the phone in his hand. He looked at it. One contact. No name. Just a number. He had not dialed this number in 5 years. He had thought about it a few times the way you think about a door in a building you're walking through. Noting that it's there. Noting where it leads. Choosing not to open it because you don't need to yet. He needed to now. He dialed. It rang once. Carter. The voice on the other end was direct and unhurried. The voice of a man who had answered hard calls before. "Admiral," Daniel said. "Talk to me. 6 months of documentation. Pattern of concealment on defense production quality failures. Active suppression of employee safety reports. Products shipped to Navy specifications that don't meet the specs they were tested against. I was just terminated for raising it internally." A pause. Not hesitation. The kind of pause that meant the person on the other end was already calculating. "Is your documentation secured? Multiple locations, all off-site. Are you safe? I'm in my truck in their parking lot." "Leave the parking lot. Drive somewhere public. Send me what you have through the channel you know." "I will," Daniel said. There was a half-second of silence. "Daniel?" "Yes, sir." "You did the right thing. Holding it this long, building the record. That's what makes this actionable." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "There's one more thing," he said. "The situation 5 years ago. The mission documentation. I have the original." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Then it's time," the Admiral said. "All of it." "Yes, sir." Daniel looked at the building one more time. "Fire them all," he said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly the way you say something that's been waiting a long time to be said. And across the line, Admiral Michael Hayes said, "I'll make some calls." Daniel drove to a diner 3 miles from Northstar. He ordered coffee he didn't drink. He used the phone to transmit the documentation index, a compressed encrypted summary of everything he had. Enough for Hayes's team to begin pulling threads before the original files were retrieved. He sat in the diner booth and thought about Lily. He thought about the note in her lunch bag. "I'll be home by 6. I was going to have to explain something today." Not everything she was 8, and there were things 8-year-olds didn't need to carry. But she was smart, and she would know something had happened the way kids know even before they're told. He tried to think of how to say it. Dad lost his job today. Too blunt. Dad had to make a hard choice today. Better. But she'd want to know more. He settled on the truth in the simplest form. "I did something important today, and it cost me something. But I'd do it again." She would ask if they were okay. He would say yes. And for the first time in a long time, he was actually certain of the answer. 26 minutes after Daniel's truck left the parking lot, 3 black SUVs pulled through the main gate of Northstar Maritime Technologies. They did not stop at the security checkpoint. They proceeded directly to the main entrance. Behind them, a 4th vehicle. 8 men in Navy tactical gear stepped out of the first 3. From the 4th vehicle, moving without hurry, in full dress uniform, stepped a man with 4 stars on his shoulder. Inside the building, Greg Paulson watched through his office window. He picked up his phone to call Aldridge. Aldridge didn't answer. Aldridge was already in the lobby. Face white, watching Admiral Michael Hayes walk through the front doors of a building that was, as of this moment, no longer operating under the same assumptions it had been 40 minutes ago. Hayes stopped in the center of the lobby. He looked at the Northstar logo on the wall. He looked at the people frozen around him. And in a voice that didn't need to be loud to fill the room, he said, "Nobody leaves, nobody touches a computer, and someone go get Richard Holloway." And Daniel Carter sat in a diner 3 miles away, drank cold coffee and pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. He wrote, "Have a great day, kid. I'll be home by 6. He folded it, put it in his pocket. He had a few hours before pickup. He figured that was enough time to watch the truth start moving. 3 miles away from Northstar, Daniel Carter sat in a corner booth at a diner called Miller's on Route 7, and he did not look like a man who had just lost his job. He sat straight. He kept his hands flat on the table. He breathed the way the Navy had taught him to breathe in situations where panic was the enemy, slow, deliberate from the belly, not the chest. The waitress came and poured coffee without asking. He thanked her. He wrapped both hands around the mug and stared at the surface of the liquid until it stopped moving. Then he pulled out his notebook and opened it to a fresh page. He wrote the date, the time, the names of every person who had been in that conference room. He wrote what Holloway had said word for word, as close as he could reconstruct it. He wrote the phrase that had struck him most: "You are no longer a good fit for this organization," because in his experience, the language people chose when they were afraid of the truth said more than the truth itself. He had been doing this for 6 months. Recording. Documenting. Building a record that no one at Northstar knew existed in its full form. And now, sitting in a vinyl booth with cold coffee going warm in his hands, he thought about how it had started. Not the day he walked into Northstar. Earlier than that. He thought about the thing he hadn't told anyone, not Carol Sims at the Inspector General's office, not Evan Miller, not anyone. The thing that had been sitting at the bottom of everything he did for the past 5 years, like a stone at the bottom of a river. I thought about a ship called the USS Caldwell, and a mission that went wrong, and a report that disappeared. And he thought about Michael Hayes picking up the phone 40 minutes ago and not asking a single unnecessary question, because Hayes already knew half the story. He was the reason Daniel had kept the other half. The memory arrived the way it always did, not gradually but all at once, like a door blown open. It was 5 years ago, and Daniel was 31 years old, and he was still wearing a uniform. He had been assigned as a technical support specialist to a naval special warfare unit operating out of a forward staging area in the Gulf region. His job was equipment maintenance, troubleshooting the translation between what a system was supposed to do and what it was actually doing in field conditions. He was not a SEAL. He had never pretended to be. But he understood the equipment those men depended on better than almost anyone, and in that world, that made him valuable. The mission in question was a maritime interdiction, a boarding operation on a vessel suspected of carrying materials that had no business being on a civilian shipping lane. Routine by the standards of what those units called routine. 8 men deployed, 4 rigid inflatable boats. Night operation radio silence, except for the designated comms window. Daniel was on the support vessel. His job during the operation was to monitor equipment telemetry and flag anything anomalous. At 42 minutes into the operation, something was anomalous. The power distribution unit on Boat 3. One of the ribs showed an intermittent fault on its navigation electronics package. Not a full failure. An intermittent fault. The kind that shows up for 12 seconds and then disappears and looks like a glitch when you review the data afterward. Except Daniel had seen that specific fault signature before in a maintenance bay on a unit that had been cleared for deployment against his recommendation. He had filed that recommendation. It had been overridden. He flagged it to his watch officer immediately. The watch officer told him to stand by. He stood by for 4 minutes. At 4 minutes and 20 seconds, Boat 3's navigation package went fully offline at a critical point in the approach. The crew had to shift to backup navigation. In the confusion, the timing of the boarding was compromised. And in the seconds that confusion created, one of the 8 men on that operation took a hit that should not have happened. The man survived. He lost function in his left hand. He was medically discharged 8 months later. Daniel wrote his incident report the next morning. 17 pages. He included the original maintenance recommendation he had filed on that unit. He included the telemetry data from the fault signature. He included the timeline precise to the second. 3 weeks later, the official incident report came back. His 17 pages had been reduced to 2 paragraphs. The conclusion cited crew, decision-making under pressure, as the contributing factor. The equipment was listed as performing within parameters. His original maintenance recommendation was not referenced. He went to his commanding officer. His commanding officer told him the matter had been reviewed at multiple levels and the findings were final. He went 1 level above that. I was told, not unkindly, but without any ambiguity, that pursuing this further would be characterized as insubordination and would affect his career. He did not pursue it further. Not then. But he kept a copy of everything. His original report, the telemetry data, the maintenance recommendation, the names of the officers who had signed off on the altered findings. He kept it in a place that was not on any military server and not in any government facility. Because Daniel Carter had learned something that his father taught him, something that the Navy reinforced in ways his father never could have imagined, and something that every experience since had confirmed: the truth does not expire. It waits. And the people who bury it always eventually need to bury something else. And the second burial is never as clean as the first. He had waited. And now the second burial was happening at Northstar Maritime Technologies, and he was the one holding the shovel they didn't know existed. He closed the notebook. He picked up his phone, the regular one, not the one under the seat, and he called the school. The secretary answered on the second ring. "This is Daniel Carter, Lily Carter's father. I need to make sure she's marked for standard pickup today. I'll be there at 3. "Of course, Mr. Carter. I'll make a note. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," he said. "Thanks for asking." He hung up. He looked at his watch. It was 9:47 in the morning. He had 5 hours and 13 minutes before he needed to be in the school pickup line. He thought about what would be happening at Northstar right now. He thought about Hayes making calls. He thought about what those calls would look like, who would be contacted, in what order, through what channels. He had enough of an understanding of how these things worked to know it would be fast. When you had documentation of the kind Daniel had, and when the documentation connected to a prior incident that had been officially buried, and when the person who had buried it was now sitting inside a company doing contract work for the same Navy, the response was not slow. The response was the kind that involved people in offices in Washington picking up phones and saying very few words. It was 9:48. He ordered breakfast. He hadn't eaten. The waitress, her name tag said Donna, came back, and he ordered eggs and toast. And she looked at him, the way people look at someone who is sitting alone in a diner on a weekday morning and seems to be carrying something heavy. "Rough morning," she said. "Getting better," Daniel said. She nodded like she believed him, which was kind of her. He sat and ate and thought about Evan Miller. Evan would be at work right now. Or he would have been until the SUVs pulled through the gate. Daniel tried to picture that moment from inside the building. The sudden noise, the unusual movement, the way information travels through a workplace in the seconds before anyone understands what's happening. The rumors that start. The way people's faces change when they realize that the authority in the room is no longer the authority they're used to obeying. He hoped Evan wouldn't panic. He hoped Marcus Webb kept his head. He hoped Sandra Cho, who had 3 kids and a mortgage, and had taken a risk by talking to Daniel 2 months ago, was going to be okay. He had thought about all of them when he made the decision to call Hayes. He had thought about them harder than he'd thought about himself. That was not nobility. That was just math. He was a single father with no savings cushion and a lease coming up for renewal, and he had known from the moment he dialed that number in the parking lot that the next chapter of his life was going to be difficult and uncertain and quite possibly costly. He had no illusions about that. He had made the calculation with full awareness of what was on the other side of it. But there were 8 people at Northstar who had raised concerns through legitimate channels and been punished for it. There were products on their way to Navy vessels that had been signed off as meeting standards they did not meet. There were men on ships who would operate that equipment without knowing that someone had moved the line instead of fixing the problem. And there was a report sitting in Daniel's records that had waited 5 years to be a part of the same story it had always belonged to. The math was not complicated. He paid for breakfast. He left a $20 on a $14 check because Donna had been kind, and Daniel believed in the direct application of gratitude. He went back to his truck. He drove to the public library, which opened at 10 and had private computer stations in the back, where he had once 3 weeks ago told the librarian he was doing research, and she had shown him to a carol without asking anything further. He sat down. He plugged in a thumb drive. He began assembling the full documentation package, not the compressed index he'd already sent Hayes, but the complete file, the one that had every serial number, every timestamp, every employee name, every version comparison between the original reports and the altered ones, and in a separate encrypted folder, the materials from 5 years ago. He worked steadily for 2 hours. He did not rush. Rushing introduced errors, and errors introduced doubt, and doubt was the only weapon the other side had left. At 11:30, his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't have saved. It said, "Package received. Proceeding. Stay available." He read it twice. He deleted it. He kept working. At 12:15, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Carter." A woman's voice. Professional measured. "My name is Special Agent Diana Reyes. I'm with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I'm told you have documentation relevant to an ongoing inquiry at Northstar Maritime Technologies." "I do," Daniel said. "We'd like to arrange a time to collect that documentation and take your statement. Can you tell me your current location?" "I'm at the Alexandria Public Library." Can you remain there for approximately 40 minutes? "Yes. Thank you. And Mr. Carter." A brief pause. The kind that meant something was being carefully chosen. "We're also aware of the prior matter you've shared with Admiral Hayes. That documentation will be handled through a separate review process. I want you to know it's being treated seriously." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "One of those men lost his hand," he said. "I know," Special Agent Reyes said. And the way she said it told him she was not reading from a script. "We know." He sat with that for a second. 40 minutes, he said. "I'll be here." He hung up. He looked at the screen in front of him. He kept working. Now, while Daniel sat in a library 3 miles away, Richard Holloway was having the worst morning of his professional life, and it was getting worse by the minute. It had started from Holloway's perspective with an ordinary Friday. A Friday he had looked for. In fact, because the Daniel Carter problem was being resolved, the disruption was being eliminated, and by the following week, everything would be back to operating smoothly. The Department of the Navy contract renewal was on track. The numbers were good. He had a dinner reservation for that evening at a restaurant in Georgetown, and he had been thinking about the wine list. Then Pete, the security guard, called his cell phone at 9:18 and said in a voice that was doing its level best to stay professional, that there were unmarked black vehicles at the front gate, and the men getting out of them had Navy credentials, and they were not stopping at the checkpoint. Holloway stood up from his desk. He walked to his window. He saw the vehicles. He saw the men. He saw stepping out of the last car, a figure in full dress whites, and even from the second floor, even from that distance, he could make out the stars. He turned away from the window. He said one word. It was not a word suitable for professional environments. He called Aldridge. Aldridge didn't answer. He called his general counsel. His general counsel picked up, and Holloway said very fast, "We have naval personnel on site, possible, federal investigators. I need you here now." And his general counsel said in a voice that had gone very carefully neutral, Richard, don't say anything to anyone until I'm there. I mean anyone. Do you understand me? How fast can you be here? 20 minutes. Make it 10. He hung up. He looked around his office, the framed contracts on the wall, the photographs with senators and defense officials. The model of the first ship, Northstar, had built systems for mounted on a mahogany base on the credenza. He had built this company from a defense subcontract worth $4 million into a primary contractor, handling $300 million in annual government business. He had done it through connections and competence, and the particular skill of knowing which rooms to be in and what to say when he got there. He had never been in a room like the one that was forming downstairs. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the door. He stopped. He thought about Daniel Carter's face in the conference room 2 hours ago. That flat, unreadable expression when he picked up the box. That single look around the room before he left. Holloway had read that look in the moment as resignation. He was beginning to understand he had misread it entirely. Downstairs, Admiral Michael Hayes stood in the center of the Northstar lobby and looked at the Northstar logo on the wall with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things built and a great many things come apart and is currently engaged in the second activity. He had received Daniel's call at 9:17. He had made 3 calls of his own in the following 8 minutes. By 9:30, 2 separate NCIS field units were already staged and moving. By 9:45, a federal judge who owed no one at Northstar anything had signed a preservation order covering all electronic records and physical documentation on the premises. By 9:53, Hayes himself was in the vehicle. He had known this day was coming, not because he had known Northstar was dirty, that had emerged gradually from Daniel's documentation pieced together over months, but because he had known from the moment Daniel Carter left the Navy that Daniel was the kind of man who walks toward the thing everyone else is walking away from, and that eventually that quality would put him somewhere important. Hayes had served for 31 years. He had commanded ships' task forces' entire theater operations. He had learned to identify early in his career the quality that separated the people you could trust with the most consequential decisions from the people you could not. It was not intelligence. It was not even courage exactly. It was something more specific. The refusal to let the distance between what was true and what was officially recorded become a place where you felt comfortable. Daniel Carter had never been comfortable in that space. It had cost him his military career in the end, not dramatically, not dishonorably, but quietly. The way careers end when a man is too inconvenient to promote and too capable to court-martial. He'd left on his own terms technically, with a medical separation that gave everyone a clean story to tell. The injury was real. The timing was convenient. Hayes had known it. He had not been able to stop it. That was a thing he carried. The lobby of Northstar was quiet, in the way that spaces go quiet when something unprecedented is happening, and no one has yet figured out what the appropriate response is. A receptionist sat frozen behind her desk. 2 employees who had been crossing the lobby, when the doors opened, now stood against the far wall as though they had decided collectively that stillness was the safest option. Hayes looked at one of his team members, a lieutenant commander named Walsh, and said, "Begin the network isolation, nothing in or out." Walsh moved. Hayes walked toward the elevator. He was going to the 2nd floor. He was going to find Richard Holloway. And he was going to have a conversation that Richard Holloway was not going to enjoy. Holloway was still in his office when Hayes arrived. He had his jacket buttoned. He was standing behind his desk, which Daniel would have recognized as the posture of a man trying to use furniture as a form of authority. Hayes walked in. He did not wait to be invited. He stood in the center of the room and looked at Holloway for a moment without speaking. Holloway said, "Admiral, I want to make clear that we welcome any inquiry, and we will cooperate fully." "Richard," Hayes said, not loudly, conversationally. "Stop." Holloway stopped. "You fired a man this morning who has documentation of safety violations, records manipulation, and suppressed employee reports going back 18 months. He also has, and I want you to hear this clearly, documentation of an incident from 5 years ago that was incorrectly adjudicated, and that connects to materials your company produced under a previous contract." Hayes paused. "You should have been worried about him the day he walked in here." Instead, you fired him in a conference room full of witnesses and gave him the rest of the morning to make phone calls. Holloway's color had gone from normal to something that was not quite gray, but heading in that direction. "My legal counsel," he started, "is downstairs, I'm told. That's good. He'll need to be here." Hayes looked around the office slowly, the photographs, the model ship, the framed contracts. Then he looked back at Holloway. "You know what I've never understood about men in your position? You spend so much effort managing the record that you forget someone else is keeping one too." Holloway said nothing. "The man you fired this morning kept a better record than your entire compliance department." Hayes let that settle. Every report that was altered, every employee who was reassigned after raising a concern, every unit that shipped with documentation that didn't match its actual test results, he has it, all of it, dated, sourced, and stored somewhere that is not this building. The silence in the room was complete. Then, Holloway said very quietly, "I want to speak to my attorney." "That's the first smart thing you've said today," Hayes told him. He turned and walked out. Back in the library, Daniel finished the documentation package at 1:17 p.m. He saved the final version, encrypted it, and prepared the physical drive for transfer. At 1:22, Special Agent Reyes arrived with a colleague. They were quiet, efficient people who shook his hand, showed credentials, and sat down across from him without performing authority at him, which he appreciated. The interview lasted 90 minutes. He answered every question completely. He identified every document. He explained every connection. He told them about Evan Miller and Marcus Webb and Sandra Cho and Paul Reyes. He noted that Reyes shared a last name with the special agent, which produced the first and only slight smile of the interview. He told them about the quality hold that had been closed without corrective action. He told them about the parameter adjustment on the M7 units. He told them about Roy Hendricks, the QA inspector, whose signature appeared on units that bore evidence of post-seal tampering. And then at the end, he opened the encrypted folder. He told them about the USS Caldwell. He told them about the mission and the fault signature and the 17-page report, and what came back as 2 paragraphs. He told them about the man who lost function in his left hand and was medically discharged 8 months later. His name was Tommy Reardon, and Daniel knew where he lived, a small house in Pensacola, Florida, because he had looked him up once 2 years after leaving the Navy, just to know. He had never contacted Reardon. He hadn't known what to say. He hoped that was about to change. Special Agent Reyes listened to all of it. When he finished, she looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer." "Go ahead." "You've been sitting on some of this for 5 years. Why now? Why this company? You could have filed the prior matter independently at any point." Daniel thought about it. "Because a file on its own is just a complaint," he said. "This," he gestured at the drive on the table, "is a pattern. Same kind of company, same kind of decisions, same way of making a safety problem look like a documentation problem. When I walked into Northstar and saw what I saw, I understood that the thing from 5 years ago wasn't isolated. It was a practice, and you can investigate a practice." He looked at her. "You can't fix an isolated incident. You can fix a practice." Reyes wrote something in her notes. Her colleague picked up the drive. Daniel looked at his watch. 2:51. He stood up. "I have to pick up my daughter at 3. Reyes looked up from her notes. Something shifted in her expression, not unprofessional but human. "Of course," she said. "We have your contact information. We'll be in touch." He shook their hands. He walked out of the library into the afternoon, and the sun was doing what March sun does in Virginia, trying and not quite succeeding. And he got in his truck, and he drove to the elementary school, and he pulled into the pickup line behind a minivan with a stick figure family decal on the rear window. He sat there. He thought about all of it. "I thought about the conference room this morning, and the box on the table, and Holloway's professional insulated voice saying, 'You are no longer a good fit.' He thought about Hayes in the lobby of Northstar saying things to Holloway that needed to be said. He thought about Evan Miller and hoped the kid had held it together. He thought about Tommy Reardon in Pensacola and the left hand that didn't work right anymore. I thought about 6 months of early mornings and late nights, and a daughter who had no idea what her father was carrying. Only that he was carrying something, because kids always know. The school doors opened. Children came out in the chaotic, joyful way that children exit schools, no organization, pure momentum. And there was Lily, dark hair, red backpack, scanning the line for his truck with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She saw him. Her face went from searching to settled in an instant. She ran to the truck and climbed in and dropped her backpack on the floor and said, "Dad, guess what Biscuit did?" "What did Biscuit do?" Daniel said. Emma said he ate an entire sock and then just looked normal for the rest of the day. No problems at all. "That's impressive," Daniel said. "I know," Lily said. Emma said the vet was like, "Some dogs just do that." She buckled her seatbelt. "Did you have a good day?" He pulled out of the pickup line. He thought about what he was going to say. He thought about the words he had rehearsed over breakfast at the diner. "I had a complicated day," he said. Lily looked at him with 8-year-old directness. "Complicated good or complicated bad?" "Both," he said. "The kind of complicated where something hard happens and then something important happens, and at the end of it, you think, okay, that was the right call." She considered this. "Like when I didn't want to get my flu shot, but then I got it, and then I felt better because I wasn't worried about it anymore." "Exactly like that," Daniel said. "Okay," she said, satisfied, and looked out the window. Then after a moment, "Are we still doing eggs this weekend?" "We're still doing eggs," he said. She nodded. She started telling him something else. He caught the words science project and volcano and baking soda, and he listened and he drove, and the sun came through the window and made the dashboard warm, and somewhere across the city, in a building that was currently surrounded by people with federal credentials and serious expressions. The truth was doing exactly what Daniel Carter had always believed it would do if you just gave it enough of a record to stand on. It was moving, and nobody was going to stop it now. That evening, Daniel made spaghetti. It was the simplest thing he knew how to cook, and also by some reliable domestic logic, the meal that made the apartment smell the most like a home. Lily sat at the kitchen table doing homework, occasionally asking him how to spell words. He was fairly certain she already knew how to spell, and he answered each time without pointing that out, because some things were about the asking and not the answering. He had not told her about the job yet. He was going to. He just needed the night to feel normal first. One normal evening, spaghetti and homework, and the low noise of the television in the other room that neither of them was watching before everything shifted into whatever came next. His phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at it. A text from a number he didn't recognize, which at this point in the day meant something specific. It said, "Evan Miller has been interviewed. Cooperating fully. You should know he had more than you realized." Daniel read it twice. He set the phone down. He stirred the sauce. More than he realized. I thought about that. About Evan sitting across from federal agents in some room at Northstar, or perhaps somewhere else by now, telling them things he had held for months. Things that he had been too afraid to put in any report. Things he had stored, the way people store things that feel too dangerous to carry, openly compressed, hidden, but not forgotten. Daniel turned the heat down on the stove. He thought about the young engineer who had met him in the break room and slid a notebook across the table. He thought about the way Evan had looked at him that day, half terrified, half relieved, like a man who had been holding his breath so long he'd almost forgotten there was another way to exist. He hoped Evan was okay. He hoped all of them were okay. But something in that text, "more than you realized," stayed with him through dinner, through Lily's bath, through the bedtime routine that involved a chapter of her book and a specific sequence of good nights that she had developed over years, and that Daniel followed precisely because it mattered to her, and therefore it mattered to him. After she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and his notebook, and he thought about what "more than you realized" could mean. He would find out the next morning. The call came at 7:43, before Lily was up, while Daniel was still in yesterday's clothes because he hadn't slept much. Special Agent Reyes. Her voice was the same as yesterday, professional, measured, but there was something underneath it now, a kind of controlled urgency. The sound of a person who has been awake for most of the night because of something that kept demanding to be looked at. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I need to brief you on some developments. Are you somewhere you can talk?" "Yes," he said. "Evan Miller provided us with documentation last night that extended the scope of what we're looking at significantly. He had records going back further than your materials. He'd been tracking anomalies since before he was reassigned in a personal system he maintained on a private server. He never filed it through official channels. He didn't trust them. But he kept everything." Daniel said, "I told him to write things down." "He did more than that," Reyes said. "Mr. Miller had communications internal emails forwarded to a personal account before his company access was revoked that show senior leadership was aware of the quality deviations on the M-Series line 9 months before you started at Northstar." Daniel was quiet for a moment. 9 months, he said. The decision to alter the parameter thresholds wasn't a reactive measure. It was planned. There are emails discussing the cost differential between a production halt and a specification adjustment. They chose the adjustment. Daniel put his hand flat on the table. He breathed. "They knew," he said. "Before I walked in the door, they already knew." "Yes," Reyes said. "Which means everything that happened to you, the warning, the reassignment, the termination, was not a response to your investigation. It was the continuation of a decision they made before you existed in that building." He sat with that for a long moment, found something. All those months of careful documentation, building the record piece by piece, telling himself that when he had enough, it would matter. And the whole time the people running that company had looked at a spreadsheet, seen the number it would cost to do it right, and chosen the number that would cost less. Before he ever walked through the front door. Before he ever opened a single unit and saw a scratch near a seal housing. They had already made their choice. He had just been the inconvenience that came with it. "Where is Miller now?" Daniel asked. "He's been placed in protective custody as a material witness. His cooperation puts him in a complicated position, but we're managing that. He has a family. A girlfriend. She's been notified. They're together." "Good," Daniel said. "Mr. Carter, I also need to tell you something about Roy Hendricks." Hendricks, the QA inspector. The man whose signature was on the units Daniel had flagged months ago. "What about him?" Daniel said. "He came forward on his own last night, before we could get to him. He showed up at the Alexandria field office at 11:15 p.m. and asked to speak to whoever was handling the Northstar investigation." Daniel had not expected that. "He brought his own documentation," Reyes continued. "He had been logging deviations for 7 months. He passed those units because he was told to, and he documented every instance. He kept the records because—" She paused, and for the first time, there was something almost human in the pause, something that wasn't quite professional. Neutrality. He said he needed to be able to prove to himself, and to anyone who asked later, that he knew it was wrong. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. All that time he had looked at Roy Hendricks's signature on those units and thought, here is one of them. Here is someone who chose the easy wrong over the hard right. And instead, Hendricks had been doing the same thing Daniel was doing in his own way, in his own silence, building a record, because the record was the only form of resistance available to him. "He's going to be okay?" Daniel asked. "He cooperated fully and proactively. That matters enormously in how this proceeds for him." Daniel nodded, though Reyes couldn't see it. "There's one more thing," she said. "And this is what I most need you to know this morning." He waited. "The material from the USS Caldwell, the prior incident. We've connected it." He stopped breathing for a second. "Connected it how?" he said. "The power distribution units on the ribs deployed during that mission, we pulled the procurement records overnight. They were sourced from a subcontractor that Northstar acquired 18 months later. Same production line, same design flaw. The fault signature you documented in your original incident report matches the exact failure mode we're seeing in the M-Series units." The kitchen was very quiet. "It's the same defect," Daniel said. "Across 5 years and 2 companies," Reyes said. "Yes, they acquired the subcontractor knowing the design had a documented field failure. And instead of correcting it, they continued production. And the prior incident report, your report was altered in a way that ensured there was no official record of the failure mode that would have flagged the acquisition as a liability. Daniel stood up. He walked to the window and stood there looking at the street without seeing it. 5 years. Tommy Reardon's left hand. The report reduced to 2 paragraphs. And the reason, the actual specific documentable reason, was that somewhere upstream, someone needed to close a deal on an acquisition, and a field failure report was an obstacle. So the field failure report became something smaller and easier, and something that did not get in the way. "Who buried the original report?" he said. "Do you know?" Reyes was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "We have a name," she said. "I can't share it with you yet, but we have a name." He pressed his hand against the window frame. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Mr. Carter, I want you to understand something. What you built, the documentation you compiled over 6 months, it's what made all of this connectable. The individual pieces existed in different places, in different records, in different people's private notebooks and personal servers and memory. Without a central thread, none of it coheres into a federal case. You are the central thread." He said nothing. "You need to know that," she said. "Appreciate it," he said quietly. After he hung up, he stood at the window for a while. Then he heard Lily's door open and her feet on the floor and her voice still blurry with sleep. "Dad, are you up already? Making breakfast?" He called back and turned away from the window and went to the refrigerator, because some things wait and some things don't, and a hungry 8-year-old does not wait. Across the city, at approximately 8:15 that same morning, Richard Holloway sat in a conference room at his attorney's firm on K Street and listened to 3 lawyers explain to him with increasing specificity the shape of what he was facing. He had not slept. He had the look of a man who had spent the night discovering that the floor he had been standing on for 15 years was not in fact solid. His lead attorney, a man named Gerald Frost, who had been handling corporate defense matters in Washington for 26 years, spread a series of documents on the table and said, "Richard, I need you to listen to me very carefully because the situation has evolved overnight in ways that require us to reassess our options." Holloway looked at the documents without touching them. "How bad?" Frost looked at him steadily. "The scope of the federal inquiry expanded last night. We're no longer looking at a potential whistleblower complaint that we can manage through arbitration and NDAs. We are looking at a multi-count federal investigation under the False Claims Act, potential violations of the National Defense Authorization provisions, and," he paused, "a reopened inquiry into a prior incident from 5 years ago that has been connected to materials in Northstar's production history." Holloway went very still. "The Carter documentation connects to a Navy incident that was previously adjudicated," Frost continued. "The NCIS has documentation suggesting the original incident report was altered to protect an acquisition that Northstar made 18 months after the incident. If that connection is established to the standard required—" "That was before my time," Holloway said. His voice had changed. Something in it was working very hard. Frost looked at him. "Richard, the acquisition there were people involved in that who—" "Richard." Frost's voice was quiet and very direct. "I need to know everything. Not the version that makes you look best. Everything. Because the people you're thinking about right now, some of them are already talking." The silence in the conference room lasted a long time. Then Holloway said the name of the person who had handed him the acquisition. The person who had told him the prior incident report was a non-issue. The person who had, in a private dinner at a club in McLean, Virginia, explained that certain documentation had been managed and that the liability exposure was contained. Frost wrote the name down. He looked at it. He looked at Holloway. "Okay," Frost said. "Here's what we're going to do." Meanwhile, Daniel had dropped Lily at school and was sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store on the phone with his sister in Ohio, telling her he had lost his job. Not the rest of it, not yet. Just the job part, because his sister was the person in his life most likely to worry about the practical things. And the practical things were real concerns and deserved real answers. His sister's name was Patricia, and she was 3 years older than him, and she had always been the kind of person who responded to bad news by immediately identifying what could be done about it. "Okay," she said when he finished. "Okay, do you have savings?" "Some," he said. "How much is some?" "Enough for 4 months if I'm careful." "Daniel." "Pat. You have a child." "I'm aware." "You can't just what happened? Why did they let you go?" He chose his words. "There were some concerns I raised about production practices. They didn't appreciate it." A pause. "Concerns like what kind of concerns?" "The kind that turned out to be accurate," he said. Another pause longer. His sister was smart. She always had been. She could hear the thing underneath the words he was choosing. "Daniel," she said. "What did you do?" "The right thing," he said. "That's not me being dramatic. That's genuinely what I think happened." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Is Lily safe?" "Completely." "Okay." He could hear her processing. "Do you need money?" "Not yet. But I wanted you to know. If something develops over the next few weeks that you hear about on the news, or wherever, I want you to hear it from me first, that I'm fine, and we're fine." That landed exactly as he intended it to. "Daniel Philip Carter," his sister said. "I'll call you when I can tell you more," he said. "I love you." He hung up before she could build up to the full speech, which was an act of self-preservation more than anything else. He sat in the parking lot for a minute. He thought about what Reyes had told him that morning, the emails, the cost differential calculation, the planned decision to adjust the specifications instead of fixing the problem. I thought about the person who had buried the original Caldwell report, the name that Reyes had and wasn't sharing yet. He thought about the dinner at the club in McLean. The conversation Holloway was probably having with his lawyers right now, the way these things moved, how the people at the top of something like this always believed, until the moment they couldn't anymore, that they were insulated by distance and deniability, and the particular Washington skill of keeping your name off the documents that mattered. And he thought about the thing Hayes had said to him once years ago on the deck of a ship in conditions that did not invite extended philosophical conversation, but that Hayes had offered anyway, with the casual certainty of a man who had seen enough to stop being uncertain about the fundamentals. Hayes had said, "The truth has a structural advantage. Lies require maintenance. Truth doesn't." Daniel started the truck. He had things to do. The investigation moved faster than Northstar's legal team expected, which is always the case when multiple people begin cooperating simultaneously, and each person's cooperation reveals something that gives investigators new leverage with the next person. It has the quality of a chain reaction, not explosive, but steady, self-sustaining, each disclosure feeding the next. In a sequence that once started, does not require outside energy to continue. By Friday evening, 36 hours after Daniel had reached under the seat of his truck and dialed a number he hadn't touched in 5 years, the following had occurred. Greg Paulson. Daniel's former direct supervisor had been interviewed and had confirmed under caution that he had been instructed by Aldridge to redirect Daniel's quality concerns away from the QA chain, and that he had followed those instructions because he understood his continued employment depended on it. Frank Aldridge, the director of operations, had retained separate counsel from Holloway's firm, which told its own story about how those two men currently viewed their shared interests. Roy Hendricks had given a 12-hour interview that included the name of every supervisor who had instructed him to pass units he had flagged with dates and descriptions of each conversation that were specific enough to cross-reference against the email records Evan Miller had provided. Sandra Cho, the testing lab employee Daniel had spoken to 2 months earlier, had come forward voluntarily on Friday morning after learning that an investigation was underway, and had produced a set of handwritten notes from her own documentation kept. She explained to the interviewing agent in a journal she stored at her mother's house, because she did not trust the security of her own home to be adequate given the atmosphere at work. That last detail stopped the interviewing agent for a moment. "You kept your notes at your mother's house," the agent said. "Yes," Sandra said. "How long have you been doing that?" "About 4 months." "What made you start?" Sandra looked at her hands. "I have 3 kids," she said. "I couldn't afford to lose this job. But I also couldn't afford to not have a record of what I was seeing in case something happened later, and I needed to prove I knew it was wrong. So I needed the notes somewhere safe." She paused. "My mom's house felt safe." The agent looked at her for a moment and then wrote something in her notes that was not part of the official record, just something for herself, something about the particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage because it looks like practicality. Like keeping a journal at your mother's house, like writing things down, because you need to be able to prove to yourself and to anyone who asks that you knew. That same Friday afternoon, two men in suits who were not from the NCIS and did not work for any law enforcement agency arrived at the offices of a defense industry consulting firm in McLean, Virginia. They were from the Department of Justice. They had a document. The document was addressed to a man who had attended a dinner 4 years ago at which certain things had been explained to Richard Holloway about a prior incident report, and why it was not, as Holloway had worried at the time, a liability problem. The man's name was not in the newspapers yet. It would be eventually. What mattered that Friday afternoon was that he looked at the two men in suits and the document they carried, and he understood with the particular clarity that comes at the moment when everything you've maintained becomes unmaintainable, that the structure he had built, the distance, the deniability, the name kept off the documents had not held. He asked for a moment. They gave him 5 minutes. He called his attorney. His attorney, to his credit, answered immediately and said 3 words. "Don't say anything." He didn't, but he thought about Daniel Carter, a man he had never met, a maintenance supervisor from a defense contractor in Virginia, a single father with a notebook and a phone under the seat of his truck. He had been briefed on Carter not by name, not directly, but in the way that powerful people are briefed on threats to their interests without ever having to ask explicitly. He knew a man had been raising concerns at Northstar. He knew Holloway had handled it. He had not thought more about it than that, because men in his position do not have to think more about things than that. I thought about it now. He thought a maintenance supervisor, a level 2 maintenance supervisor. And he thought about the particular vertiginous feeling of realizing that the most dangerous person in any equation is the one you decided wasn't worth taking seriously. Daniel spent that Friday afternoon in a legal aid office in Alexandria, getting advice from a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower protections, and who had been recommended to him by Carol Sims at the Inspector General's office, who it turned out had been tracking the Northstar situation since Daniel's call to her 3 weeks earlier, and had already begun preparing a parallel referral to the Department of Labor's Whistleblower Protection Division. The lawyer's name was Helen Park. She was Korean-American in her early 50s, with a direct manner that Daniel found immediately trustworthy. She did not waste his time with preambles. She said, "Under the False Claims Act, if Northstar's contract violations are established, you are entitled to a percentage of any federal recovery as a qui tam relator. Do you know what that means?" "Some," Daniel said. "It means that the people who defrauded the government are not the only ones with a financial stake in this outcome. You are too. The percentage varies between 15 and 30% of the federal recovery, depending on the scope of your assistance and the degree to which your information was already known to the government." Daniel looked at her. "How much could that be?" "That depends entirely on what the investigation establishes. If we're talking about contract fraud on the scale suggested by the documentation you've described, units shipped under false certification, systematic records, alteration on a multi-year defense contract, you could be looking at a recovery in the tens of millions, potentially more." She paused. "I want to be clear that this is not a certainty. These cases take time. But I also want you to understand your rights." Daniel sat with that for a moment. He had walked out of Northstar that morning with a cardboard box and a job he no longer had, and a daughter who would need to be told her father's income situation had changed. He had not, in all the months of documentation and planning, thought about this part. Not once. He had thought about the PCUs on Navy vessels. He had thought about Tommy Reardon in Pensacola. He had thought about Evan Miller and Sandra Cho and the men on ships who would operate equipment they had been told was safe. He had thought about Hayes and the Caldwell and 5 years of waiting for the truth to have enough company to stand on. He had not once thought about the money. Helen Park was watching him with the expression of someone who had seen this reaction before and knew what it meant. "You didn't do this for the recovery," she said. It wasn't a question. No, he said. I know, she said. But you should still know your rights, especially with a child to provide for. He nodded. I'll take the case, she said. No upfront fee. We work on contingency. She extended her hand. He shook it. He walked out of Helen Park's office at 4:45 on a Friday afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the particular exhaustion of a person who has been running on adrenaline and purpose for 36 hours and has just sat still long enough for the body to notice. His phone buzzed. A text from Hayes. 3 words. It's moving fast. He texted back. I know. Then after a pause he added, How's Reardon? The response came 30 seconds later. We're reaching out. He'll know soon. Daniel pocketed the phone. He looked at the street. He thought about Tommy Reardon in a house in Pensacola, going about a Friday afternoon with no idea that somewhere in Washington, a name had been connected to a document that connected to the decision that had changed his life. He thought about what that call was going to be like, not the logistics of it, but the human weight of it. The moment when a man who had spent 5 years believing that what happened to him was a function of chaos or bad luck, or the impersonal grinding of events, discovers that it was instead a decision. Made deliberately. By a specific person. For a specific reason. That was harder than chaos in some ways. But it was also something you could name. And naming a thing was the beginning of being able to put it somewhere, instead of carrying it everywhere. He walked to his truck. He had 45 minutes before Lily's after-school program ended. He drove to the grocery store the real trip this time, not the parking lot phone call, and he walked the aisles and put things in a cart and thought about what they needed for the week and calculated the budget with the awareness that he was now calculating without a paycheck coming in and found that the number was manageable if he was careful, and that careful was something he had always been good at. Howe was in the cereal aisle when his phone rang. Unknown number, but a Virginia area code he recognized as Federal Building Exchanges. He answered. Mr. Carter, this is Assistant United States Attorney James Whitfield. I'm handling the criminal referral arising from the Northstar investigation. Do you have a moment? Yes, Daniel said, standing in the cereal aisle with a box of Lily's preferred brand in his hand. I want to inform you personally, you'll receive formal communication as well, that a federal grand jury has been convened. The investigation has been elevated to a criminal matter. Indictments are expected within the next 30 to 60 days, pending the completion of several ongoing interviews. A brief pause. Mr. Carter, the record you maintained over the past 6 months is exceptional. I want you to know that. In 20 years of federal prosecution, I have rarely seen a private citizen maintain documentation to this standard. You understood what would be needed before we knew we would need it. Daniel stood in the cereal aisle. He thought about a notebook in his back pocket, a habit from the Navy. Write everything down. Memory is unreliable. Paper isn't. I just kept notes, he said. Yes, Whitfield said. You did. And it made the difference. After he hung up, he stood there for another moment, just breathing. Then he put the cereal in the cart and kept moving because there were 6 more things on the list and he needed to be across town in 38 minutes. That evening after dinner, pasta again, different sauce. He sat down at the kitchen table while Lily was doing homework and he told her. Not everything, but enough. He told her he had left his job at the company where he worked. He told her it was because of something he believed was right to do and that it had cost him the job and that they were going to have to be careful with money for a while, but that they would be okay. Lily looked at him with that focused, direct attention she brought to serious things. Did you get in trouble? She said. No, he said. Not really. Some people are unhappy with me, but I didn't do anything wrong. She thought about this. Did you do something right? He looked at her. Yeah, he said. I did. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and looked back at her homework. Then she said without looking up, Okay, you should always do something right, even if it costs you something. He looked at his daughter for a moment. Where did you hear that? He said. She glanced up. You say it all the time. He didn't remember saying it, but maybe he said things without knowing. Maybe the things you believed most deeply were the ones you said in the spaces between the things you meant to say. Yeah, he said. I do believe that. I know, she said, and went back to her homework. He sat at the table and watched her work and thought about the week that had just happened. About the parking lot and the phone call, and Hayes walking into the Northstar lobby, and Holloway's face going gray, and Roy Hendricks showing up at the federal field office at 11:15 at night with his own documentation because he needed to be able to prove to himself that he knew it was wrong. About Sandra Cho's journal at her mother's house. About Evan Miller's private server. About Tommy Reardon, who would get a call soon that would change the shape of the past 5 years of his life. About a name that Reyes had and wasn't sharing yet, but that was now, as of this afternoon, in front of a federal grand jury. He thought about all of it. And then he thought about something much simpler, the eggs. The cooking lesson he had promised Lily for the weekend. He had not forgotten it. He had in fact bought eggs at the grocery store, the good ones in the cardboard carton, because they were teaching a skill, and you should use the right materials when you are teaching a skill. That was the next thing. That was enough. The eggs were a disaster. Not catastrophically, no smoke alarms, no broken yolks on the floor. But Lily's first attempt at a scrambled egg produced something that was technically cooked and texturally closer to a kitchen sponge than food. And she stared at it in the pan with the specific betrayal of a person who had expected better results from a straightforward process. That's not right, she said. No, Daniel agreed. But it's fixable. That's the thing about eggs. You can always try again. She looked at him. How many eggs do we have? Enough, he said. Keep going. She cracked another egg. She was more careful this time, slower, paying attention to the heat in a way she hadn't the first time, because the first time she'd been paying attention to looking like she already knew what she was doing. That was the real lesson, though. Daniel didn't say it out loud. The first attempt is almost always about appearing competent. The second attempt is when you actually learn. That Saturday morning, 9 days after the black SUVs rolled through Northstar's front gate, felt in the particular quiet of the apartment almost normal. Almost like a morning that had nothing to do with federal grand juries or NCIS interviews, or the name that Reyes still hadn't shared, but that was by now presumably being discussed in rooms Daniel would never be invited into. His phone was on the counter face down. He had made a rule for Saturday mornings. The phone stayed face down until Lily was occupied with something that didn't need him. It was a rule he had made when she was 5, and he first came home from the Navy and discovered that being physically present in a room while mentally somewhere else was not the same as being there. She'd taught him that without meaning to. Kids have a way of demanding your full attention, not by asking for it, but by being exactly interesting enough that you feel the loss when you're only half there. The second egg was better. Soft, just barely set the way a scrambled egg should be. Lily looked at it with satisfaction. That one's right, she said. That one's right, he confirmed. She ate it standing at the counter, which was a thing she did that he'd stopped trying to change, and he had coffee, and for 8 minutes on a Saturday morning, the world was small and warm and sufficient. Then his phone buzzed. Face down, he felt it against the counter. He left it. It buzzed again. He turned it over. 2 texts, both from Reyes, sent 3 minutes apart. The first said, "We have movement on the secondary name. Call when you can." The second said, "It's bigger than we thought." He looked at the texts. He looked at Lily, who was now examining the second egg with the analytical attention of someone planning their approach to the third. "Hey kid," he said, "I need to make a quick call. You okay for a few minutes?" "Can I try another one?" she said, meaning egg. "Yes, low heat, don't rush it." He stepped into the hallway. He called Reyes. She picked up on the first ring, which told him she had been waiting. "Talk to me," he said. "The name from the Caldwell inquiry," she said. "The person who handled the report alteration 5 years ago. We've been working on establishing the connection to Northstar's acquisition, and last night we got it. Bank records. The acquisition was structured to include a consulting fee routed through 2 shell entities paid to an individual with direct access to Navy procurement oversight." Daniel leaned against the hallway wall. "Someone inside the Navy," he said. "A former officer, retired, currently working as a defense industry consultant. He sat on 2 naval advisory boards in the 18 months surrounding the acquisition. He had access to the inquiry process on the Caldwell incident, and he received $230,000 in consulting fees from entities connected to Northstar in the year before the acquisition closed. Daniel said nothing for a moment. He thought about the Caldwell, about the 17-page report, about the officer who had told him not unkindly that pursuing it further would affect his career. "Does Hayes know?" he said. "Admiral Hayes was briefed last night," Reyes said. "He's the one who identified the financial structure as anomalous. He flagged it to the FBI Financial Crimes Unit." A pause. "He found it, Daniel. He went looking specifically because you told him what to look for." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. 5 years. Hayes had carried it too. Not in the way Daniel had. Hayes had the rank and the distance that made it abstract political something that required the right moment and the right lever. But he had carried it. And when Daniel put the phone under the seat of his truck and handed him the lever, Hayes had not wasted a day. "What happens now?" Daniel said. "The FBI has opened a parallel investigation on the financial crimes component. The DOJ is coordinating. We're looking at potential RICO implications if the shell entity structure shows a pattern across multiple contracts." She paused. "This is no longer a whistleblower case with federal contract fraud implications. This is organized corruption of defense procurement. Multiple actors, multiple contracts, multiple years." Daniel heard what she wasn't saying alongside what she was. "How many people?" he said. "We don't know yet. That's what the financial investigation is for." Another pause, and this one was different, more careful. The pause of someone choosing words with precision. "Mr. Carter, I want to be honest with you about something. When this becomes public, and it will become public probably within the next few weeks, your name will be part of the story. There's no way to prevent that. Whistleblower protections cover your employment and your retaliation claims, but they don't make you anonymous in a story this size." He had known that. He had known it the moment he dialed Hayes's number in the parking lot. Some costs you calculate in advance, some you just accept. "Okay," he said. "Your daughter," Reyes said. Not a question, just acknowledging the thing they were both thinking. "I'll handle it," he said. He went back to the kitchen. Lily had produced a third egg, this one unmistakably correct, soft golden at the edges, slightly underdone in the center, the way good scrambled eggs should be. She presented it to him on a plate. "For you," she said. "Since you've been doing this longer, you should see if I'm doing it right." He sat down and ate the egg. "It's perfect," he said. She beamed, then immediately moved on to something else the way children do. When they've accomplished something, they don't linger in it, they just collect it and go. She wandered toward the living room. He heard the television. He sat at the table with the empty plate. "I thought I need to tell her more. Not everything, but more. Before she hears it somewhere else." He thought, not today. Today is eggs. But soon. The news broke on a Tuesday. Not the full story, not yet. But enough of it. A reporter at the Washington Post had been working a source inside the federal investigation for 10 days and had enough to print something that was careful but specific. A major Virginia defense contractor under federal investigation for contract fraud records, manipulation, and potential corruption of procurement processes. No names yet, by legal agreement with the DOJ, which wanted the indictments in place before the story ran in full. But enough that anyone inside the industry who read it knew exactly which contractor it was. Daniel found out. The story was running at 6:47 in the morning from a text from Helen Park that said simply, "Tuesday. Front page. Below the fold, but prominent. Be ready." He read the article on his phone at the kitchen table before Lily woke up. He read it 3 times. It was accurate. It was measured. It used phrases like alleged fraud and under investigation and sources familiar with the matter. It did not name him. He texted Helen ready. His phone started buzzing at 7:15 and didn't stop. His sister Patricia called at 7:18. He answered. "Daniel," she said. Her voice was doing something complicated, trying to be calm while clearly not being calm. "I'm okay," he said before she could ask. Is that article? Yes. A long exhale. You knew this was coming. Yes. For how long? I thought about 6 months of notebooks. About the early mornings and the late nights. About the written warning in his personnel file, and Lily's drawing of the house with the secret room, and Tommy Reardon in Pensacola. A while, he said. His sister was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dad would have done the same thing. Daniel said nothing. I mean that, she said. He would have done exactly the same thing, and it would have driven me crazy, and I would have been terrified the whole time, and I would have been proud of him every single day. He pressed his fingers against his eyes for a moment. Thank you, Pat, he said. Don't thank me. Just tell me what you need. Nothing right now, but stay available. Always, she said, and they hung up. By 9 a.m., Daniel had received 43 messages from people he knew, from people he barely knew, from former Navy colleagues whose names he hadn't seen in years, from the 3 Northstar employees he'd been in direct contact with, from Carol Sims at the Inspector General's office, who wrote simply, "Well done from Helen Park," with updates every 20 minutes, and from a number he didn't recognize, that turned out to be a journalist from a television network who had gotten his number from somewhere Daniel didn't want to know. He didn't respond to the journalist. He sent Lily to school same as every morning. She noticed something she always noticed, and she looked at him in the truck on the way there and said, "You have your concentrated face." "My concentrated face," he repeated. "Like when something important is happening, and you're thinking about 12 things at once, but you don't want me to know." He looked at her briefly. "When did you identify that?" "A long time ago," she said matter-of-factly. He pulled up to the school. "I'll tell you more tonight," he said, "about what's been happening. More than I told you before." She looked at him steadily. "Is it bad?" "No," he said. "It's the right thing working the way it's supposed to. It's just loud when that happens." She thought about this. Then she kissed him on the cheek and got out of the truck, and he watched her walk through the school doors with her red backpack and her complete unself-conscious confidence. And he thought, I will do anything to keep her world as intact as I can, while the larger world does what it needs to do. He drove to Helen Park's office. She was waiting with coffee and 2 other attorneys, and a whiteboard that already had things written on it. She was the kind of person who, when things accelerated with them without losing precision, and Daniel found that quality immediately steadying. "The DOJ called this morning," she said, handing him coffee. "They want to move the timeline up on the formal whistleblower designation. The article has created pressure to clarify your status before more press happens." "What does that mean practically?" Daniel said. "It means that within the next 48 hours, your protections are formally codified. It also means..." She glanced at her colleague, a younger attorney named Marcus, who had been on the phone when Daniel arrived and had the look of someone who had been on the phone since 5 a.m. "That the qui tam filing we prepared is being formally entered. The government is intervening in the case, which is the best possible outcome. It means they believe the evidence is strong enough that they're taking it on directly." Daniel looked at her. "What does government intervention mean for the recovery?" "It means the percentage shifts," she said. "When the government intervenes, the qui tam relator you receives between 15 and 25%, rather than 25 to 30. But it also means the recovery itself is more certain and likely larger, because the government's resources behind a False Claims Act case are considerably greater than any private relators." Daniel did the math roughly. He didn't know the exact numbers yet. He wasn't sure he wanted to know yet because the number felt like a distraction from the thing he still needed to stay focused on. "What do I need to do today?" he said. "Statement to the DOJ this afternoon. Formal interview on the record to establish your timeline and decision-making process." It's a formality. At this point they have your documentation, but it closes the loop on the record. She looked at him. "And Daniel, when they ask you why you did this, tell them exactly what you told me. Don't dress it up. Don't make it sound strategic. Tell them the plain truth." "It was the plain truth," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you not to change it." The DOJ interview was at 2 p.m. in a federal building in downtown Washington. The room was not uncomfortable. A conference table, decent chairs, water in a carafe in the center. 2 attorneys from the DOJ Special Agent Reyes, and a court reporter who typed with the quiet, relentless efficiency of someone who had been typing rooms full of consequential things for many years. Assistant U.S. Attorney Whitfield led the session. He was a careful man, mid-50s, steady, the kind of person who asks questions in the same tone, whether the answer is going to help him or complicate his day, because he genuinely wants the answer regardless. He walked Daniel through the timeline from the beginning. The first week at Northstar. The scratched seal housing on the PCU. The notebook. Greg Paulson's instruction to stay in his lane. Frank Aldridge's office, and the phrase "there may be context you're not fully aware of." The written warning. The reassignment to the shipping preparation area, which Daniel explained calmly, specifically, as an attempt to position his signature near the problem documentation in the event of a future investigation. Whitfield looked up at that. "You recognized it as a setup." "Yes," Daniel said. "And you didn't leave." "No." "Why not?" Daniel looked at him. "Because leaving would have meant taking myself out of the position where I could still document what was happening. And because it would have been easier, and I've found that when the easier thing and the right thing are in direct opposition, the easier thing is almost never the one you can live with." Whitfield wrote something. He asked about the phone under the seat of the truck. He asked about Hayes. Daniel explained the relationship, the prior service, the promise. He explained the USS Caldwell and the 17-page report and the 2 paragraphs it became. He explained Tommy Reardon's name and the left hand and Pensacola. When he said Reardon's name, Whitfield looked up from his notes. "You kept his name," Whitfield said. "You looked him up." "Yes." "But you never contacted him." "No, I didn't have anything to tell him yet." "And now," Daniel looked at him steadily, "has anyone called him?" "Admiral Hayes spoke with him on Sunday," Whitfield said. "I can tell you that Reardon is aware of the investigation and aware of your role in it." Daniel nodded. "He asked if he could contact you," Whitfield said. Something moved through Daniel's chest. Not quite an emotion he had a clean name for, but something in the neighborhood of the feeling you get when a weight you've been carrying so long you've stopped noticing it suddenly shifts. "I'd welcome that," he said. At 4:15, the session ended. Whitfield shook his hand at the door and said again that the documentation was exceptional. Daniel thanked him the way you thank someone who is doing their job well, not effusively, just with sincerity. He walked out of the federal building into a Tuesday afternoon that was doing its best to be unremarkable and failing, and he stood on the steps for a moment. His phone buzzed. A number he didn't have saved. Florida area code. He knew before he answered. "Mr. Carter." The voice was male, middle-aged, with a slight roughness that wasn't accent, but something else the quality a voice gets after years of carrying something heavy. "Yes," Daniel said. "Is this Reardon?" "Tommy," the man said. "Yeah. The Admiral gave me your number. I hope that's okay." "More than okay," Daniel said. He sat down on the steps of the federal building because standing suddenly felt like more effort than the moment required. "He told me what you did," Tommy said. "The whole thing, the documentation, going back 6 months, and the Caldwell report. He told me you kept the original." "I did," Daniel said. A silence. "I always thought it was my fault," Tommy said. "The way the official report read decision-making under pressure. I thought I'd made the wrong call in those seconds. I've thought that for 5 years. Daniel pressed his hand against his knee. "You didn't," he said. "The equipment failed before you had a decision to make. You had 12 seconds of corrupted navigation data. There was no right call available. The fault was upstream of you. It was upstream of all of us." Another silence. When Tommy spoke again, his voice had changed. Something had gone out of it, and something else had come in. And the something else was fragile in the way that things are fragile when they've been compressed for years under the wrong kind of weight. 5 years, Tommy said. "I've been carrying that for 5 years." "I know," Daniel said. "I'm sorry I couldn't get to you sooner." "You got there," Tommy said. "That's—" He stopped, started again. "You didn't know me. You had no reason to keep my name, no reason to look me up." "I had every reason," Daniel said. Tommy didn't answer that immediately. Daniel let the silence sit the way you let silence sit when someone is working through something and needs the space. My wife thinks I should come up to Virginia, Tommy said finally. When whatever happens next happens, she thinks I should be there. I think that's right, Daniel said. Yeah. A small sound, not quite a laugh, not one. She's usually right. They talked for another 20 minutes, which neither of them had planned. They talked about the Caldwell and the unit, and the night of the mission, trading the details of the same event from two different vantage points. The way you fill in a picture when two people who were each holding half of it finally compare. It was not a comfortable conversation. It was necessary in the way that some uncomfortable things are necessary, not therapeutic in any performed sense, but real. The kind of real that happens when two people who have been carrying pieces of the same truth recognize each other across the gap. When they hung up, Daniel sat on the steps for another minute. Then he called Patricia. I know you have a million questions, he said. I do, she said. Ask them. I've got an hour before school pickup. She laughed a real laugh, the kind that means relief more than humor, and she asked them. All of them. And he answered every one cleanly and completely, because his sister had earned it, and because some truths need to be told to the people who love you before they fully exist. The indictments came down on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the black SUVs rolled through Northstar's gate. Daniel found out from Helen Park at 7:20 in the morning, same as the article a text before Lily was awake. It said, Indictments unsealed. Holloway Aldridge and 4 others. Federal counts include wire fraud, False Claims Act violations, obstruction of a federal investigation. Separate indictment, unsealed in financial crimes matter, retired officer, 2 associates. Check your email. He read it sitting at the kitchen table in the gray early morning coffee, warming his hands. 6 names. 7 counts on the primary indictment. 3 on the secondary. He read the names. Holloway. Aldridge. The name Reyes had held back for 6 weeks. A retired rear admiral named Victor Crane, who had sat on 2 naval advisory boards and routed $230,000 through shell entities connected to a defense acquisition. He read the name, Victor Crane, and thought about a dinner in McLean, Virginia, that he had never attended, in a room where decisions were made about what the record would say and what it would not say, and what that was worth monetarily to the people making them. He thought about Tommy Reardon's left hand. He thought $230,000. I thought about what that number was supposed to buy, and what it had actually cost, and the arithmetic of it was not complicated, and was also not something he could sit with for too long without it becoming something dark, so he set it down. He put the phone on the table. He looked at the kitchen, the pan hanging on the hook by the stove. The drawing on the wall, a new one, a house with towers taller than the last version with more rooms. Lily came out at 7:40, hair still messy, wearing the oversized sweatshirt she'd taken from his closet 2 years ago and claimed as her own. She poured cereal. She looked at him. You have the concentrated face again, she said. Big day, he said. Good big or hard big? He thought about it. Both. The kind where something that took a long time to be true becomes officially true. And it's good. But it's also a lot. She sat down across from him and ate cereal and looked at him with the full, uncomplicated attention of a child who had decided her father needed to be looked at right now. Are you okay? She said. He looked at his daughter. I thought about the parking lot and the phone, and 3 words that had taken 5 years to become the right 3 words at the right moment. He thought about a notebook in his back pocket and a man in Pensacola who had stopped blaming himself for something that was never his fault. He thought about Evan Miller and Sandra Cho and Roy Hendricks and Marcus Webb and all the people who had kept their own private records in their own private places because they needed proof for themselves that they had known. Yeah, he said, I'm okay. And he meant it, which was different from the other times he'd said it. She went back to her cereal satisfied. He picked up his phone and texted Hayes, saw the news. Thank you. Hayes responded in 4 minutes. 4 minutes you did the work. I just had the stars. Daniel smiled at that. He typed back. Pair well together. Hayes. They do. Dinner. When this settles. You name the place. Daniel. Somewhere my kid can come. Hayes. Obviously. He put the phone down. He got up and started making Lily's lunch the same way he'd made it every morning for 3 years. Peanut butter and honey, no crusts, apple sliced into 8 pieces. He wrote the note and folded it inside. He looked at the note before he put it in. He thought about what to write. He wrote, "Today is a good day. Big things happened, and they happened right. I love you. See you at 3. He folded it. He put it in the bag. He zipped the bag. He handed it to Lily when she came back from getting dressed, and she slung it over her shoulder without looking at it, because she never looked at the note in the morning. She read it at lunch in the cafeteria, and Daniel knew this because she had told him once very matter-of-factly that reading it at lunch was when she needed it most. He drove her to school. She talked the whole way, something about a project, something about Biscuit, the sock-eating dog, something about whether eggs could theoretically be cooked in a microwave and whether that would count as real cooking. He gave his opinion on the microwave egg question, which was firm, and she argued back with the cheerful persistence of someone who enjoys the argument more than the conclusion. He pulled up to the school. She grabbed her bag. She kissed him on the cheek. "Dad," she said, door half open. "Yeah. Whatever the big thing is, you did it right." He looked at her. "How do you know?" he said. She shrugged in the easy way she had. "Because you always do," she said, and jumped out and ran through the school doors without looking back. He sat in the pickup line for a moment after she disappeared. He thought she's going to be fine. He thought we're going to be fine. He thought about Helen Park's office and the whiteboard and the Quitam filing and the number he still hadn't let himself look at directly because it felt still like a distraction from the thing. But the thing was done now. The thing had moved through the world the way he'd believed it would move slowly, and then all at once, and it had landed where it needed to land, and the people who needed to answer for it were going to answer for it in a federal courtroom. He pulled out of the school lot. He had a meeting with Helen at 9. A call with Reyes at 11. A call he had been putting off with the journalist from the television network that he had decided after talking with Helen he was going to take because there was a version of this story that deserved to be told in full publicly. Not for him, but for every person who had ever written down what they saw in a private notebook and kept it at their mother's house and hoped that someday the record would be enough. It was enough. He drove toward Washington in the ordinary Tuesday morning traffic, and the city moved around him the way it always moved. Indifferent, enormous, full of people, doing the 10,000 ordinary things that constituted a life, and inside all of that ordinariness, Daniel Carter felt something settle in him that had not been settled in a very long time. Not peace, exactly. Not the absence of anything. More like the presence of something. The specific quiet rightness of a man who put a thing where it belonged and can now carry something lighter. His phone rang. Tommy Reardon. He answered. "My wife booked the flights," Tommy said. "We'll be in Virginia next week." "Good," Daniel said. "I know a diner. Good eggs." Tommy laughed, a real one this time, no ambiguity. "See you then," he said. Tommy Reardon was a bigger man than Daniel had pictured. Not in height, they were roughly the same, but in the way he carried himself, the particular solidity of someone who had rebuilt themselves after something tried to take them apart. He walked with a slight adjustment in his left shoulder, compensating for the hand, and he did it so naturally that you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it, and Daniel was looking for it because he had thought about that hand for 5 years. They met at Miller's Diner on Route 7, the same booth where Daniel had sat with cold coffee on the morning of the firing 9 weeks ago now. Tommy came in with his wife, a compact, direct woman named Carla, who shook Daniel's hand first and looked at him the way people look at someone they've heard a great deal about and are now measuring against the version they built in their head. Whatever she found, she seemed satisfied with it, because she sat down and immediately said, "Okay, he's been practicing what to say to you for a week, and I told him just talk like a normal person, so that's what he's going to do." Tommy looked at her. "Carla." "It's true," she said, picking up the menu. Daniel smiled, the first completely unguarded smile he'd had in weeks, maybe months. "Then let's just talk like normal people," he said. For the first 10 minutes, they talked about practical things. Flights, the hotel, how Virginia in May was different from Pensacola in May, which was a conversation about weather on the surface, and about the strangeness of being in an unfamiliar place for an important reason just underneath. Donna came and poured coffee without asking, same as always, and Tommy watched her do it with the faint surprise of a man encountering a diner that operated with the efficiency of a place that had been running long enough to know what people needed before they asked. Then Carla put her menu down and said, "Tommy, say it." Tommy looked at Daniel. "I spent 5 years," he said, "believing I had made the wrong call. That if I had done something different in those 12 seconds, trusted my backup nav faster, communicated differently. Anything that the outcome would have been different. I went over it so many times it stopped being a memory and turned into something else. Something I just lived with. Like a sound you can't turn off." Daniel said nothing. He let it come. "And then Hayes called me," Tommy said. "And he walked me through your documentation, the telemetry, the fault signature, the original maintenance recommendation you filed on that unit." He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. 12 seconds. I had 12 seconds of accurate navigation data before the unit failed. There was nothing I could have done differently because the problem existed before I was ever in that boat. "Yes," Daniel said quietly. "You knew that," Tommy said. "You knew it the next morning when you wrote the report." "I knew it," Daniel said. "And they buried it. They buried it." Tommy put both hands on the table, the right one flat, the left one slightly curled, the way it would always be now. He looked at them for a moment. "My daughter is 7, he said. "She's never known my left hand to work right. She thinks that's just how dads are built." He looked up. "I'm not angry about the hand. I made my peace with the hand a long time ago. What I couldn't make peace with was thinking it happened because I failed. That's what I couldn't put down." Daniel looked at him directly. "You didn't fail. You performed correctly with equipment that had already failed you. The record says that now. The official record." Tommy nodded slowly. His eyes were bright. He was not going to cry in Miller's diner. Daniel could tell he was the kind of man who had decided a long time ago that there were places for that, and public diners were not among them. But the brightness was there. "Thank you," Tommy said. "I know that's not... I know you didn't do this for me. I know there was a lot more to it than one man's story." "Your story was part of it," Daniel said. "The beginning of it, actually. The thing that connected Northstar to something older and larger. Without the Caldwell, the Northstar case is a fraud case. With it, it becomes a pattern. And patterns are what get fixed so they don't happen again." Carla had been quiet, but now she put her hand over Tommy's on the table, the left one specifically, and she looked at Daniel and said, "He went back to work 6 months ago. He's a marine equipment instructor at a training center down in Pensacola. He teaches young guys how to maintain the things they're going to depend on out there." Daniel looked at Tommy. Tommy shrugged the way men shrug when they've found a way to turn something painful into something purposeful and don't want to make too much of it. "Seemed like the right use of what I know," he said. Daniel understood that completely. They ate breakfast. The 3 of them, and the conversation moved. The way good conversations move, not in a straight line, but finding its own level, touching the serious things, and then releasing them, moving to something lighter, coming back. Tommy talked about Pensacola, and Daniel talked about Lily, and Carla talked about the drive from the hotel that morning, and Donna refilled coffee twice without being asked. At one point, Tommy said, "What are you going to do next, work-wise?" Daniel had been thinking about that. Helen Park had called him 2 days earlier with the first concrete numbers. The federal recovery in the Northstar case was being calculated, and his share under the Qui-Tam settlement pending final court approval was going to be substantial enough that the word substantial felt inadequate, and the actual number still felt unreal. He would not be rich in any way that changed what he was. But he would not worry about Lily's college, or the lease, or the 4-month savings cushion that had felt so precarious 9 weeks ago. "There's a technical safety training organization," Daniel said, "for workers in defense manufacturing, teaching maintenance crews how to identify and document quality deviations, how to protect themselves when they do, how to build the kind of record that holds up." He paused. "I've been talking to them about coming on full-time." Tommy looked at him. Teaching other people to do what you did. Teaching other people to do what they already know is right, Daniel said. That's different. Most people who see something wrong already know it's wrong. They just need to know that someone will be there to receive what they build if they build it. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, that's the right next thing." Daniel agreed. When they left the diner, Tommy and Carla with a flight back to Pensacola in 4 hours, Daniel with the rest of the afternoon before school pickup. Tommy stopped on the sidewalk and extended his right hand. Daniel shook it. Then Tommy extended his left hand too, the one that didn't fully close, and Daniel took that one as well, and they stood there for a moment like that. And it was not theatrical. It was just two men who had been connected by a piece of broken equipment and a buried report, and 5 years of silence, and were now connected by something else. The specific unspoken solidarity of people who know what it cost and did it anyway. Carla hugged Daniel, which he hadn't expected, and said in his ear, "Take care of that little girl." "Every day," he said. He watched them walk to their rental car. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then he got in his truck, and the sun was doing what May sun does in Virginia, finally committing warm and direct, no longer the hesitant March version, and he drove toward the city with all the windows down. The trial preparation began in early June, and Daniel's role in it was more structured and more demanding than he had anticipated. Not because the legal team asked more of him than he'd expected, but because the scope of what the investigation had uncovered kept expanding in ways that connected to his documentation in new angles he had to address. The financial crimes case against Victor Crane had opened a thread that pulled through 3 other defense contracts spanning 8 years. The DOJ team working that case called him twice a week for the first month. The Northstar criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring. The civil false claims case would resolve earlier, probably in settlement. Helen Park told him, because companies facing this level of documented fraud almost always settled rather than let a jury see the emails. It was during one of those DOJ calls, a Wednesday morning in June. Lily at school, Daniel at his kitchen table with his notebook open and his coffee going cold, that he learned the thing he had not anticipated. Greg Paulson had testified before the grand jury. Not Aldridge, not Holloway, not any of the senior leadership Daniel had spent 6 months watching. Greg Paulson, his direct supervisor. The man who had eaten a breakfast burrito and told Daniel that his job was to keep the machines running and nothing else. The man who had looked at the table in the conference room the morning of the firing and not made eye contact. Paulson had walked into the U.S. Attorney's office voluntarily, without a subpoena, without counsel present, and had given a 7-hour statement. He had been cooperating since week 2. It turned out he had gone in the moment he realized the investigation was criminal and not administrative, and the DOJ had kept it quiet. And in that 7-hour statement, Greg Paulson had said something that the DOJ attorney relayed to Daniel with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information that is more than information. He had said that on the day of Daniel's termination, after Daniel walked out of the conference room with the cardboard box, Paulson had gone back to his office and sat at his desk for 15 minutes and done nothing. Not eaten his burrito, not made a call, just sat. And he had thought about a conversation he'd had with Daniel in the hallway 3 months earlier, when Daniel had stopped him and said, "Greg, I know you're in a hard position. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just asking you to not pretend you don't know what you know." And Paulson had said nothing in response and walked away. And he had been walking away from that moment ever since, until the day the SUVs came through the gate and he understood that the walking was over. Daniel listened to this. He didn't say anything for a moment. The DOJ attorney said, "He mentioned you specifically, said your documentation gave him something to point to when he talked to us, something to hand over that was already built." He said, a brief pause, paper shuffling. He said he knew it was right because someone had already done the hard work of proving it was right. Daniel looked at his notebook on the table. The current one, number 4 since he'd started at Northstar, nearly full. He thought about Greg Paulson eating a breakfast burrito and looking at a table and walking away for 3 months. He thought about what it costs a man to live in the space between knowing and acting, the particular corrosion of it, the way it gets heavier as time goes on rather than lighter. The way you tell yourself tomorrow, and tomorrow until tomorrow, arrives in the form of black SUVs. He didn't feel vindication about that. He felt something closer to recognition. Because he had been Greg Paulson once. Not at Northstar, not in this situation, but there had been a moment in his Navy career years before the Caldwell when he had seen something and calculated the cost and chosen the easier path and then had to live with that choice for long enough that the living with it became its own education. He had never told anyone about that moment. But it was part of why he'd kept the Caldwell report. Part of why 6 months of notebooks had been possible. You do not build that kind of discipline for the first time in a crisis. You build it in the ordinary moments, the small choices, the daily practice of being honest with yourself about what you see. Tell him, Daniel said to the DOJ attorney, that it counted. A brief pause. I'll pass that along. The full story broke in August, not just the Post article from May, which had been careful and partial. The full story, Holloway, Crane, the acquisition, the Caldwell connection, the 5 years. Tommy Reardon's name, which Tommy had agreed to make public because he said he was done being a private sorrow when he could be a public point. 3 major outlets ran it within 24 hours of each other, which meant it had the weight of something that wasn't going away. Daniel's name was in all of them. He had done one interview, the television journalist he'd put off for months, a woman named Kira Sato who turned out to be exactly as serious about the story as her reputation suggested. The interview ran 42 minutes on a Sunday evening. He wore the same blue shirt he'd worn to work at Northstar because Helen Park had told him to wear something he actually owned and not something purchased for the occasion, and it was the right call. Kira asked him near the end. The question he had known was coming because it was the question everyone eventually asked, why you had a daughter to support. You were already dealing with a medical separation, a new job, a single-parent situation. The rational calculation for most people would have been to document your concerns and move on. Why didn't you? He looked at her for a moment. Because there were people on ships, he said. Real people doing real work who were going to use equipment they had been told was safe. They didn't have a choice about that. They couldn't opt out. And I was one of the few people who knew that the thing they were depending on had been signed off on with a lie. He paused. I couldn't make myself be okay with that. I tried. In the beginning, I genuinely tried to stay in my lane and trust the system and believe that someone else was going to catch it. But I knew too much to believe that. And once you know, you either act or you become a different person than you can live with. Kira was quiet for a second. Were you scared? She said. Every day, he said. Not of them. I was scared of not being enough, of doing it wrong, of building a record that looked complete and turning out to have missed the thing that mattered. Of having a conversation with Lily someday where she asked me what I did and me having to tell her I did something I tried, but it wasn't enough. He looked at his hands for a moment. That's what kept me careful. Not bravery. Fear of being inadequate. It was the most honest thing he said in the interview, and he knew it was honest because it was the hardest thing to say, and the hardest things have a quality to them when they come out that's different from everything else, lighter and heavier at the same time. The interview clip that circulated most was 37 seconds. The part where he talked about the people on the ships. It was shared 200,000 times in the first 48 hours, which Helen Park told him about, and which he registered with the particular detachment of a man for whom numbers at that scale don't correspond to anything in his actual experience. What registered was the email. It came through Helen Park's office. She was handling his public correspondence, filtering out the noise, and flagging the ones that mattered. She sent him 12 from the first week after the story broke. Workers at other defense contractors. A woman who had been fired from an aerospace manufacturer 3 years earlier for raising quality concerns. A former hospital administrator who had documented falsified safety records. A machinist from Ohio who had kept his own notebooks for 2 years and never known what to do with them. Every single letter said some version of the same thing. I thought I was alone in this. I didn't know there was a way to build a record that holds. Can you tell me how you did it? He read all 12 of them at the kitchen table on a Friday evening while Lily was doing homework, and when he finished the last one, he sat for a long time without moving. I thought about what he had told Tommy in the diner. Most people who see something wrong already know it's wrong. They just need to know that someone will be there to receive what they build if they build it. He had said it as a description of the training job he was taking. Reading these letters, he understood it was more than a job description. It was a need, a real widespread specific need, running through every industry that touched public safety, carried by ordinary people who had kept their notebooks at their mothers' houses and waited for a moment that might never come, not knowing that the thing they most needed was not a law or a federal agency, but the knowledge that the record they were building would matter to someone who knew how to use it. I took out a piece of paper. He wrote back to all 12. Not form letters. Individual responses addressing what each person had described specifically. He told them what he had done step by step. He told them what had worked and what had not. He told them about Helen Park and the IG's office and the importance of off-system storage. He told them to write everything down. He told them to date everything. He told them to identify one person they trusted inside or outside their organization who could hold a copy of what they built. He spent 3 hours on those 12 letters. Lily came in at 9:15 to say goodnight and found him still at the table writing. "You're writing letters," she said, looking at the paper with the mildly surprised expression of someone who lives in the digital age, encountering an analog artifact. "Yes," he said. "To who?" "People who need to know something," he said. She looked at the letters, then at him. "Is it the same thing, like what you've been doing?" "Related," he said. "Different people, same situation." She considered this. "Are you going to help them?" He looked at the letters on the table. 12 people, 12 different industries, 12 different situations, all converging on the same fundamental human experience of seeing something wrong and not knowing if acting on it would matter. "Yes," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and kissed him on top of his head. A thing she had started doing recently, this small reversal of the usual direction of parental affection that he found unexpectedly moving every time. "Good," she said. "Night, Dad." "Good night, kid." He listened to her door close. He picked up his pen. He kept writing. 3 months later, Daniel Carter started the job at the National Defense Worker Safety Initiative, a non-profit training organization that had existed for 11 years in relative obscurity and had, in the wake of the Northstar story, received more inquiries in 90 days than in the previous 5 years combined. His title was Documentation and Advocacy Training Director. His office was a repurposed conference room with a whiteboard and 2 desks and a window that looked out on a parking lot, which suited him fine because he had never needed a view to think clearly. On his first day, 7 people came to his first workshop. Defense manufacturing workers, 3 of them currently employed at contractors with active government contracts. 2 of them recently terminated, 1 still in litigation. 1 who had driven 4 hours from West Virginia because she had read about the workshop online and had a folder at home in her car that she had been adding to for 8 months. He started the workshop the same way. He started every workshop after that by putting a notebook on the table and asking the room how many of them had already been keeping records of what they'd seen. 6 out of 7 raised their hands. He looked at them. "Good," he said. "Then we're not starting from scratch. We're just making what you've already built strong enough to hold." He taught them the specifics. Off-network storage. Date and timestamp discipline. The difference between a complaint and a documented pattern. How to identify a second person to hold copies. How to protect themselves under the False Claims Act before they ever needed to use it. How to find the Carol Simses and the Helen Parks of the world before the crisis arrived. I was not a charismatic teacher in the performed sense. He didn't use slides. He didn't have a signature phrase. He just knew exactly what he was talking about, the way you know things that cost you something to learn, and that quality transmitted itself in a room more reliably than any presentation technique he'd ever seen. After the workshop, the woman from West Virginia. Her name was Beth. She was 53, she worked in composite materials manufacturing, came up and waited until everyone else had left and then said, "I have a folder in my car, 16 months of documentation. I didn't know if it was enough." "Can I see it?" Daniel said. She went and got it. He looked through it not quickly, carefully, and when he finished, he looked up and said, "It's enough. It's more than enough. This is exactly what you need." She pressed her lips together. She nodded. She was not going to cry in this conference room, he could tell, because she was the kind of person who had been being strong for 16 months and was not going to stop now. But her eyes were bright, and her hands were still on the folder, and she said, "I didn't know if anyone would know what to do with it." "I know what to do with it," he said. "And I know who to call." He introduced her to Helen Park by phone that afternoon. That was Tuesday. By Friday, Beth was officially a protected whistleblower with legal representation and a formal inquiry underway. 16 months of being alone with a folder in a car. 4 days from the moment she walked into a conference room and raised her hand. Daniel thought about that a lot in the months that followed. About the distance between what people carry privately and what becomes possible when they find the right room. About the particular alchemy of a person who has kept a record for the right reasons, not for recognition, not for revenge, but because they needed to be able to prove to themselves and to anyone who asked that they knew. He thought about Roy Hendricks showing up at the federal field office at 11:15 at night. About Sandra Cho's journal at her mother's house. About Greg Paulson sitting at his desk for 15 minutes, doing nothing, processing the weight of what he knew. About Evan Miller's private server, and Marcus Webb's vanished report, and Paul Reyes, and all the other people who had been moved, sidelined, written up, managed into silence. I thought about Tommy Reardon teaching young men in Pensacola how to maintain the things they would depend on. He thought about Lily, who was 9 now, and who had started keeping her own journal, a small one with a purple cover, because she said she wanted to remember things accurately, and she had learned from her father that memory was unreliable and paper wasn't. He thought about Admiral Hayes, who had called 2 weeks ago to tell him that the Crane case had resulted in a guilty plea. Victor Crane, retired, Rear Admiral, had pleaded guilty to 1 count of honest services fraud and 1 count of obstruction, and would spend the next 3 years accounting for what a buried report was worth to the people who paid to bury it. Hayes had said on that call, "You know what I keep thinking about? You kept that original report for 5 years. In the back of a drawer somewhere, I assume." "A lockbox," Daniel said. "In my sister's garage." Hayes had laughed. "Your sister's garage." "She didn't know what was in it," Daniel said. "I told her it was important documents. She told me to label it so she didn't throw it away when she cleaned, so I labeled it." "What did you label it?" Hayes said. Daniel thought about the label he had written 5 years ago on a piece of masking tape stuck to a fireproof lockbox in Patricia's garage in Ohio. He said, "Truth, pending." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's exactly right." It was exactly right. Because the truth doesn't disappear when it's buried. It waits. It accumulates companions, other truths, other records, other people who wrote things down in private notebooks and kept journals at their mothers' houses and came to workshops in repurposed conference rooms with folders they'd been adding to for 16 months. And when enough of those companions gather in the same place at the same time with documentation that meets the standard with people who know what to do with it, the truth stops pending. It moves. And nothing that has ever tried to bury it has found a way to make it stay buried when it decides to move. Daniel Carter knew that the way he knew the things that cost you something to learn, not as an idea, but as a fact, proven in the specific documented time-stamped off-network, legally certified terms of a man who had staked everything on it being true. It was true. It had always been true. He just made sure it had the record to prove it.